Summertime feels easy warm nights, laughter, the sense that nothing can go wrong. But the dark doesn't take vacations. A whistle in the trees, a spark in your campfire, a pale figure by the water. Footsteps on a stranger's roof each start small, then twist into something undeniable. You're being watched. Stay with me, because whatever you think is safe isn't. A cold summer night. Summer was the greatest season by a long shot. That was a hill Jake would die on any day. His love for summer didn't revolve around partying or drinking as some might expect, but nature. Warmer weather and the outdoors were inseparable in his opinion, and he guaranteed that when the heat rolled through, he spent more hours outside than inside. It was a warm night in mid-June, a few summers ago when this happened. Jake was 17 or 18 at the time. For context, there was a massive nature preserve near his house. When Jake said massive, he meant it. It was close to 1,000 acres in size. To this day, there were still parts of it that he was positive he hadn't explored. Two of his friends and he had agreed to spend a night camping in those woods. Technically, camping there was strictly forbidden and borderline illegal, but they figured there was no chance someone would catch them in such a dense forest. They would just have to trek as deeply as possible. Chuck was the camping fanatic of the group. That kid loved cosplaying as a Boy Scout and probably knew close to 100 different knots. Their other friend Jackson always supplied the drinks. If they were sober, he was unhappy. That's just how things went when Jackson was involved. Jake remembered the feeling of the gentle summer breeze blowing through his hair as the three of them packed up Jackson's car. The weather was ideal. Not too cold, not too hot. A few beers later, the three of them found themselves lugging camping equipment through the woods at around 11:30. He couldn't lie. Jake was feeling the alcohol start to hit him as they marched along. Chuck always carried this industrial-grade flashlight with him, so the darkness of the forest wasn't much of an issue. As much as Jake enjoyed the outdoors, though, traversing through thick woods at this hour was a bit creepy, even with Chuck's flashlight on hand. After close to half an hour of straight walking, the three of them found themselves in a small, flat clearing that was an ideal spot to set up camp. They pitched their tent as per Chuck's instruction and set their chairs up. The fire was the next step. Chuck once again took the lead on this, and after a few more minutes, they had a pretty decent fire going. Jackson reached into his bag and tossed Jake another drink. He then grabbed his JBL speaker and started playing some music. The vibe was perfect, and they must have been talking and drinking for a good 2 hours. They were all pretty drunk at that point, and Jake could tell the other guys were just about ready to pack it up for the night. Jackson turned the music down and started collecting discarded beer cans. Just then, a deafening whistle pierced the silence. Jake nearly jumped out of his seat, going from drunken haze to high alert in a matter of seconds. He couldn't describe it. The whistle was abnormally loud but still sounded distant. Jackson quickly shut the speaker off, and the three of them sat in silence as they exchanged concerned looks. Jake could feel his heartbeat pounding through his chest. They sat there, frozen in place for what seemed like forever, listening intently to their surroundings. But there was nothing. It almost seemed quieter now than it had when they first got there. Eerily quiet. Not even the normal wood sounds one would anticipate. Jake used that time to play his memory of the whistle back in his head. It definitely wasn't an animal's noise. The best way he could describe it was a standard whistle you'd hear at a ballpark. Chuck finally broke the silence, quietly urging them to pack up and leave. Jackson and Jake disagreed with that plan, though. They might risk encountering whoever made the noise, which Jake was beyond terrified of. It was past 3 a.m. at this point. An encounter this late would only mean trouble. Chuck hypothesized that whoever made that noise was probably aware of their presence, which was a chilling thought. Jake didn't know what to do. On one hand, staying put violated every survival instinct he had. Packing up and leaving at this hour didn't seem like a much better option either, though. They finally agreed to wait it out. Jake went to put the fire out, but Chuck cautioned him against it, saying that a fire would repel any dangerous animals. Only then did the true gravity of the situation smack Jake in the face. They were literally miles away from any civilization. It was 3 a.m., and there was an unknown entity somewhere in the darkness. Another 10 minutes or so passed, and they had resumed talking, but at a much lower volume with no music. Jake didn't think any of them felt safe going to sleep just yet, though. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. Something small flew over the darkness of Jackson's shoulder and landed directly in the fire. It was a firecracker. Jake screamed bloody murder as it started sparkling in the fire, and Chuck cursed as he sprung up out of his chair and bolted into the darkness. Jackson and Jake scrambled to follow, leaving all of their stuff behind. They caught up with Chuck, whose flashlight was beaming wildly through the woods as he frantically sprinted. They ran until they couldn't anymore, and Jackson keeled over and threw up. Chuck shut the light off, and the three of them stood there, panting, trying to figure out if they were being followed. To Jake's surprise, it didn't seem like anyone followed them. He didn't think he had ever been so afraid, though. Why in the world would someone have done that? They needed to figure out what to do. Jackson wanted to just find their way out of the woods and never come back, but Chuck was reluctant to leave all of his camping gear behind. Plus, he reminded them the fire was still active. Jake was dumbfounded. How could Chuck be concerned with forest fires after what had just happened? Eventually, Jake agreed with him that they should at least check on the site. After all, no one had actually chased them, so there was a slight possibility that whoever threw that firecracker was just playing a cruel prank. Chuck was a navigational expert and was actually able to retrace their footsteps. Jake could make out the glow of the fire as they quietly approached. Before he could get any closer, though, Jackson put a hand in front of him and pointed with a horrified look on his face. Jake strained his eyes to make out the sight in the distance. What he saw was probably the most terrifying thing he'd ever laid eyes on. There were three people sitting motionlessly in their chairs like statues. The one whose face Jake could see looked lifeless, and his mouth hung open. He was afraid to move. What were they even doing, he thought, realizing that they weren't even talking. This was not normal. The three of them watched for a little while longer before deciding to back off. They turned to leave, but Jackson's foot clipped a rock, causing him to curse in frustration. Within seconds, the glow from the fire abruptly went dark, as if it had been covered with a cloak. It was freakishly fast. They didn't stick around another second. They sprinted away from the site, but this time they could hear footsteps crashing behind them. They didn't stop. They bolted out of the woods and ran all the way to Jackson's car. By some miracle, they weren't followed out of the woods. None of them spoke on the drive back, each lost in his own thoughts. The next day, Chuck insisted they return to the site in the daylight to collect his belongings. Jackson wanted nothing to do with that, but Jake agreed to accompany Chuck. After some searching, they eventually found the site, which looked mostly untouched. That is, until they got a little closer and noticed the putrid smell coming from Chuck's tent. He unzipped it, and they found a dead, rotting rat. It was sickening. Jake took the hint, and he hasn't been back to that preserve since. Summertime shadows. This happened last summer around mid-July. Adrian was home from college for a few weeks, just trying to enjoy the break before his next semester started. Adrian lived in Maryland, and he had been talking with his two closest friends, Jason and Marcus, about doing something together, just the three of them, like they used to back in high school. They all went to different colleges now, so it was rare they got time like that. They ended up planning a weekend beach trip to Ocean City. Jason's family owned a small beach house there they didn't use much, and he got permission for them to stay for a few days. It was nothing fancy, just a two-bedroom place a couple blocks off the sand, but it was perfect for what they needed. Time to relax, party a bit, and catch up. They drove down on a Friday afternoon. The weather was hot, upper 80s with that heavy, humid air that stuck to the skin. It smelled like sunscreen and salt water the second they rolled into town. They spent the day walking the boardwalk, messing around in arcades, and people watching. The beach was packed with tourist kids running with beach balls, families with umbrellas and coolers, and lifeguards constantly yelling at people to move out of restricted areas. Everything felt normal. It was just a fun summer day. Later, they went back to the house, grilled burgers, had a few drinks, and started playing drinking games. By midnight, they were drunk and bored, and someone, maybe Marcus, suggested they go back to the beach. There's something weirdly appealing about being near the ocean at night. At night, the beach was almost completely empty, the air cooled down, and there was a certain peace to it. They didn't bring much, just some hoodies in case they got cold, their phones, and a flashlight Jason grabbed from a kitchen drawer. They didn't plan to swim, just hang out and maybe walk along the shore. They headed down a side street onto the wooden boardwalk, then took the steps down to the sand. As expected, it was basically deserted. The waves were steady, and the only light came from a few lamps on the boardwalk and the moon hidden behind clouds. There was barely enough visibility to make out where the water met the shore. They walked along the edge of the surf, letting the cold water hit their ankles now and then. They joked, talked about random things, and killed time. After a while, they stopped near one of the lifeguard towers, those wooden ones they take down at night, and lay in the sand looking up at the sky. That's when Jason noticed something. He suddenly sat up and said, "Is that someone walking over there?" They all sat up and looked in the direction he pointed. At first, Adrian didn't see anything. It just looked like a dark blur near the shoreline. But then he did. A figure, just a silhouette at that point, walking slowly right along the edge where the water touched the sand, probably 50 or 60 yards away. They figured it was just another person out late like them, maybe going for a walk. But then they noticed the movement was off. The figure wasn't strolling as someone enjoying the beach would. The walk was stiff, slow, almost mechanical. The arms didn't swing naturally and the posture was strange. The head was tilted down, not fully as if staring at the sand or scanning it. They all stopped talking and watched quietly. Something about it put Adrian on edge. He remembered whispering, "What the hell are they doing?" Marcus suggested maybe the person was looking for something. Jason joked that it was probably a drunk tourist who dropped their keys. They laughed it off and went back to messing around, but Adrian kept glancing at the figure. A few minutes passed, and the figure had stopped moving. They weren't walking anymore. They were standing completely still now, and they were definitely closer, maybe 30 yards away. That's when Adrian started to feel really uncomfortable. They tried not to stare or shine their light, but it was getting hard to ignore. There was just something wrong about the whole thing. They've been standing there for like 5 minutes, Marcus said. Who just stands like that? Then Jason said something that made Adrian's stomach drop. He's not just standing. He's looking at you, Adrian. Adrian didn't know if Jason was joking. He laughed nervously and said, "Nah, he's looking at the sand." But Jason shook his head. "No, look closer. His head's tilted at you." Jason pointed the flashlight at him. Adrian didn't want him to do that, honestly, but Jason clicked it on and aimed the beam. The light hit the figure for a second before the battery started dying and the beam flickered. That second was enough. Adrian saw him. He was almost grayish-white, shirtless, wearing wet jeans clearly from the ocean. His arms hung limp at his sides. His head was tilted at a weird angle, not broken, but unnatural. And his eyes. They were wide open, almost bulging. The instant that beam of light hit him, he moved fast. Without hesitation, he broke into a full sprint straight at them. It was impossibly unnatural. There was no build-up. He went from standing completely still to running at full speed like he'd launched forward. All three of them screamed and bolted. They didn't even look back. They just ran. Adrian could hear Marcus behind him yelling, "Go!" as their feet pounded into the sand. His lungs burned. They ran all the way back to the steps leading up to the boardwalk and didn't stop until they reached the street. Only then did they turn around. But the figure wasn't there. The beach was empty. There were no footprints behind them, just the sound of waves. They stood frozen, trying to make sense of it. They didn't talk much on the walk back to the house. Once inside, they locked the doors and windows, pulled the blinds shut, and stayed up until sunrise. None of them could sleep. Adrian kept expecting knocking or that pale face outside the window, but thankfully it never came. The next morning, they tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably some cracked-out homeless guy trying to scare people. But deep down, none of them believed that. The way he moved, the way he appeared out of nowhere, the lack of footprints, it made no sense. They stayed one more night but didn't leave the house. They left early the following morning. Over the next few weeks, they tried to move on, but then Jason texted Adrian one night. He'd been having the same dream over and over. He'd wake up and see the guy standing in the corner of his room, soaking wet, head tilted, just staring. No movement, no talking. just standing. Adrian told Jason that was messed up, but he didn't tell him he was having the exact same dream. Everything was the same in Adrian's dreams. The man, the posture, the silent presence standing in his room. Sometimes Adrian woke thinking he heard the sound of wet footsteps in his hallway, but when he checked, no one was there. Then, almost a year later, Adrian was scrolling through a local Facebook group that posts about Ocean City when a photo popped up. Someone had uploaded a picture taken from the beach the night before. It was grainy and dark, but Adrian recognized what they were talking about. Does anyone know who this creepy guy is that I saw standing by the water at like 1 a.m.? Read the post. Adrian clicked the photo. It was blurry, but he recognized him instantly. Same posture, same pale skin, head tilted, looking down at the water. The comments chilled him further. Dozens of people said they'd seen him too. Some said he'd been there for hours. One person claimed they watched him walk into the water and never come back out. Another said they found wet footprints on their back porch 2 streets from the beach, with no prints leading to or from them. Adrian didn't know what they had seen that night, but he knew one thing. He would never go back to that beach at night again. Summertime Uninvited. This happened to Dylan last summer when he was 22. He wasn't a very outgoing kid at the time. If he ever did anything social, it was because his degenerate friends had somehow dragged him out of the house. This was one of those times. Well, it was supposed to be. His friend Philip invited him to a house party at like 8 p.m. It was pretty spontaneous, but Dylan had nothing going on, so he reluctantly agreed to go with him. He knew Philip was going to give him crap if he refused. Dylan couldn't even lie, though the idea of a party, even with strangers, sounded more appealing than being alone. Philip was a few towns over from him, so it made more sense for them to drive separately instead of going together. Philip gave him the Addy, and Dylan was on his way. The literal second Dylan pulled onto the street, Philip bailed at the last minute. Rightfully so. Dylan was super frustrated. How could Philip bail on him like this? There he was, feeling like a complete idiot outside a stranger's house. Annoyed but determined not to waste the night, Dylan decided to go in. Drove all the way here, he thought. Might as well go inside. He walked up the front steps and knocked on the door. The host, Randy, greeted him warmly. Randy was instantly likable, charismatic, and friendly without being a douchebag. He introduced Dylan around, and things were actually less awkward than Dylan had anticipated. People were really friendly to him despite not knowing who he was. There were even a few girls he had his eyes on. Dylan decided to enjoy the party and hit the booze. Hard. It was getting pretty late, but the party was still raging. Admittedly, he might have overdone it with the drinking. At one point, Dylan was so nauseous and dizzy that he needed a break. It must have been close to 2 a.m. at that point. He went upstairs to look for a bathroom, but they were all occupied. The house was deceptively big. Granted, it was probably the alcohol, but Dylan was literally getting lost, stumbling through the maze of hallways up there. After making it to the top floor, he found a door leading to what seemed like an attic or storage room. Desperate for privacy, he figured it was as good a place as any to pull himself together. He groped around blindly for the light switch, but there was none. This was definitely an attic or something, as there was also dust everywhere. There was a window in the far corner which Dylan opened, allowing the cool night breeze to wash over him. There was a solid minute there where he was seriously considering throwing up onto the roof. The breeze somewhat cured his nausea though, so he just kept his head hung out of the window. It was dark outside, and the quiet was a refreshing contrast to the boisterous chaos downstairs. Sometimes all he needed to restore his state of mind was a gentle breeze and some peace and quiet. Just as Dylan was about to close the window and head back, he heard a faint noise. Footsteps on the roof shingles. That didn't make any sense, though. Was he going crazy? Curious, Dylan climbed out onto the roof. In all honesty, there was probably a 0 chance he would have done that if he had been sober. He slowly stood up and looked around. In the moonlight, he saw something terrifying. There were two masked figures with bags emerging from another window. It dawned on Dylan. Randy's house was being robbed. He started panicking. Should he shout and confront them? Then a more pressing question hit him. What if they were armed? In his clumsy state of disbelief, he slipped and scuffed one of the shingles pretty loudly. One of the burglars heard it and jolted his head in Dylan's direction. Their eyes briefly met and Dylan froze. The man nudged his partner, and the two of them quickly started making their way across the roof. Adrenaline surged through Dylan. He couldn't let them get away. Randy had been so welcoming, and Dylan felt a surge of loyalty. He decided to act. He quietly followed the burglars across the roof, keeping a safe distance. They headed towards a sloping part of the roof for an easier escape. As they climbed down, Dylan pulled out his phone to dial 911 but fumbled in his drunken state, dropping it. The phone clattered loudly, and the burglars turned sharply. "Who's there?" one of them hissed. Heart pounding, Dylan ducked and scanned his surroundings, spotting a loose roof shingle. Without thinking, he grabbed it and hurled it towards them. It missed, but the noise startled them, causing one to lose his footing. He tumbled down the roof, crashing into the gutter before falling to the ground. The other burglar, now panicked, leaped to a neighboring tree and scrambled down. Dylan rushed to the edge of the roof and saw the fallen burglar, groaning on the ground. He needed to alert everyone. As he turned to head back, he heard sirens. Someone else must have called the cops. Dylan stumbled back into the attic room and made his way downstairs, trying to appear calm. The party was still in full swing, oblivious to the drama outside. He found Randy laughing and chatting with guests. "Randy, you need to call the police. There's been a robbery." "I saw the burglars on the roof," Dylan said. Randy's face turned from amusement to shock. "Are you serious?" he asked. As he hurried to make the call, Dylan explained what happened. The party mood shifted from celebration to concern. Apparently, one of Randy's neighbors had coincidentally already called the police to file a noise complaint, which was an incredibly ironic turn of good fortune. When they arrived, Dylan recounted his story, leading them to the injured burglar. The man was arrested, but his partner had fled. The party ended abruptly. People started scattering and the lights got flipped on. Dylan tried his best to act sober, but even after all that happened, he was still stumbling a bit. Randy thanked him profusely, still in disbelief. As for Dylan, he was just glad he could help, despite the bizarre and terrifying circumstances. Looking back, Dylan still couldn't really explain why the burglars would have chosen a house having a party to rob, but maybe they had prior knowledge of the house and knew no one would be upstairs. He figured that would be the end of the story, but fast forward a few months, and he had quite the update. Dylan was playing video games at Philip's house one night when Philip got a call from Randy, who invited them over for a few beers. Up until that point, Dylan hadn't actually realized the two of them were that close. The first thing he noticed when he pulled up to Randy's house was the front door, and every window in sight were completely different. Was he not remembering the house right? He could have sworn the windows in the front door had been white, but they were all gray and much more heavy-duty looking. Randy waved them in, and they went down to his basement. They cracked a few beers and started playing a game of pool. To Dylan's surprise, Randy actually recognized him from the party and thanked him again for his trouble. What Randy told them was actually crazy, though. Apparently, the burglar the police caught that night refused to snitch on his partner and was currently serving a lengthy prison sentence. The police hadn't been able to get any leads into catching the other guy, though. Randy told them that not even a week after the incident happened, his family started receiving threatening letters from an unknown sender, some of which included pictures of Randy and his family members. Obviously, they reported these occurrences, but the police had no real leads. A month after that, Randy's mom noticed a suspicious vehicle circling the house at like 1 a.m. And a few days later, Randy's dad claimed that things in their backyard had been gone through and moved around. In response, Randy's dad upped their home security a degree, and even went as far as to replace and reinforce all their doors and windows. Dylan was shocked. This was still an ongoing issue for Randy, and Dylan had no idea how serious a situation like this could get. Summer was fast approaching, and he was sure he'd have another update when he saw Randy again.